Down from the hills leapt Erkenbrand, lord of the Westfold. Down through the fire and smoke rode the Eoreds of the Rohirrim, scattering the wild men of Dunland before them. In terror the Dunlendings threw down their weapons, and many fell on their knees crying for mercy. But the men of Rohan were hard and grim, and they drove the beaten men out of the deep, slaying many as they fled. The battlefield was a place of reckoning, where centuries of hatred boiled over into blood and fire. The Dunlendings, desperate and enraged, had fought with all the fury of those wronged and dispossessed. But against the disciplined might of the Rohirrim, their rebellion crumbled, leaving them to beg for mercy from the very people they despised. And the mercy of Rohan was fleeting. The men of Rohan, hardened by the siege of Helm's Deep, had no room for forgiveness in their hearts. To them, the Dunlendings were nothing more than brigands and savages, whose treachery had nearly delivered Rohan into the hands of Saruman. Yet to the Dunlendings, this was not just a defeat, it was another chapter in an unbroken history of humiliation and dispossession, a fresh wound on a scar that ran as deep as the mountains. The hatred between the Dunlendings and the Rohirrim was no fleeting quarrel. It was a fire that had smouldered for generations, fueled by greed, betrayal, and an unrelenting thirst for vengeance. Long before the Horse Lords came galloping across the plains of Calenardhorn, the Dunlendings had called the land their home. They were a proud, rugged people, living off the land in the shadow of the misty mountains. Their bond with the earth was deep and enduring, rooted in a way of life that had endured for centuries. But that life was shattered when the men of the West came. With the gift of Calenardon to the eachother by Gondor's steward Sirion, the Dunlendings saw their ancestral lands handed over to strangers. To them, the Rohirrim were not noble allies of Gondor, but invaders who had stolen their birthright. The plains of Rohan, once their sanctuary, became a symbol of their loss. Their forests were cut down, their villages razed, and their people pushed to the margins, into the hills and rugged terrain of Dunland. To the Rohirrim, the Dunlendings were trespassers, squatters who refused to accept the new order. To the Dunlendings, the Rohirrim were the usurpers, whose golden halls were built on stolen soil. If there was ever a hand to stir the embers of this ancient hatred into a roaring blaze, it was Saruman's. The wizard, seeing the Dunlendings' bitterness as a weapon, offered them vengeance in exchange for their loyalty. Under his guidance, they became his foot soldiers, raiding Rohan's borders with unrelenting fury. Saruman fed them lies, stoking their hatred for the Horse Lords. He promised them the return of their lands, the expulsion of their enemies, and the restoration of their honour. And the Dunlendings, weary of their status as outcasts, rallied to his cause. They took up arms, not as allies of Isengard, but as the embodiment of their ancestors' grievances, seeking to reclaim what had been lost. For the Dunlendings, the war waged under Saruman's banner was more than a campaign, it was a reckoning. Though they fought for Isengard, their true enemy was Rohan, and even as their rebellion crumbled at Helm's Deep, the memories of their grievances remained vivid, etched into the hearts of a people who felt abandoned by time and justice. But to understand why the Dunlendings clung so fiercely to their hatred, we must delve deeper into the roots of their despair. Their enmity with Rohan was not born on the battlefield, but in the slow, grinding erosion of their culture, land, and dignity. When the Rohirrim first rode south from the eachother, they came as saviours to Gondor. Steward Sirion had called upon their aid to stem the tide of the Balcoth and preserve the realm of men in the face of destruction. The eachother answered, and in their victory, they were rewarded with the fertile plains of Calenardon. To Gondor, this was an act of necessity, a bond forged in gratitude. But to the Dunlendings, it was a betrayal that would echo across centuries. Displaced from their lands, they were driven westward, forced to eke out a living in the harsh hills of Dunland. They became wanderers, no longer lords of their own destiny, but vagrants in the shadow of Rohan's prosperity. The Dunlendings had no allies to champion their cause. Gondor had long forgotten them, its gaze fixed on the threat of Mordor, and so they turned inward, nursing their wounds and passing their hatred down through generations. Their songs, their stories, their very language became steeped in bitterness, each word a reminder of what had been taken. The conflict between the Dunlendings and the Rohirrim was more than a struggle for land. It was a clash of cultures as profound as any in Middle-earth. The Dunlendings, rooted in ancient traditions, lived as hillmen, hunters and herders. They revered the wild places, the forests and the rivers that had sustained them for generations. Their lives were simple, their bonds to the earth unbroken. The Rohirrim, by contrast, were a people of the plains, swift and proud. Their mastery of horses was unmatched, their culture defined by mobility and martial skill. They built great halls of wood and stone, carving their legacy into the landscape with an unyielding confidence. To the Dunlendings, the golden-haired horse lords were a people apart, arrogant and alien, their ways incomprehensible. This cultural divide only deepened the hatred. The Dunlendings viewed the Rohirrim as defilers of the land, while the Rohirrim saw the Dunlendings as wild and uncivilized. Even the Rohirrim's proud tongue added fuel to the fire. In their language, the word for Dunlending, for Goyle, meant strawheads, a cruel insult that spoke to their contempt. One of the most infamous chapters in this long enmity came during the reign of Helm Hammerhand, King of Rohan. The Dunlendings, under the leadership of Wulf, launched a brutal invasion seeking to reclaim their lost lands. Wulf's army was fueled by vengeance, his hatred for the Rohirrim as deep as the roots of the White Mountains. For a time, Wulf's forces overwhelmed Rohan, even capturing Edoras and forcing Helm to retreat to the Hornburg. But Helm was a king of unyielding resolve, and though the winter was harsh, his spirit was harsher still. He struck back against the Dunlendings with ferocity, his fists as much a weapon as his sword. The Dunlendings tell stories of Helm walking through the snow, clad in white, a ghostly figure that killed their men with his bare hands. This war left scars on both peoples. For the Dunlendings, it was yet another defeat at the hands of Rohan, another dream crushed beneath the hoofbeats of the Rohirrim. For the people of Rohan, it was a victory, but one stained with blood and suffering. The bloodshed during the reign of Helm Hammerhand marked a turning point in the bitter history between the Dunlendings and the Rohirrim. Though Wulf's rebellion had failed, it left a legacy of unrelenting hatred that would smoulder through the ages. Each skirmish, each insult, and each betrayal only deepened the rift. By the time of the War of the Ring, this ancient feud was no longer just a memory. It was an unbroken chain of vengeance, with both sides bearing the weight of the past. It was Saruman, ever the master of manipulation, who saw an opportunity to turn this enduring hatred into a weapon. From his tower in Isengard, he whispered promises to the Dunlendings, playing on their grievances and stoking the flames of their resentment. He spoke to them not as a lord, but as an ally, weaving lies into truths. Saruman promised the Dunlendings that the lands stolen by the Rohirrim would be theirs once more. He offered them weapons, strategy, and the backing of his orcish legions. For the first time in generations, the Dunlendings believed they could reclaim their birthright. They flocked to his cause, not for Isengard, but for the promise of vengeance against the Horse Lords. When the armies of Saruman descended on Helm's Deep, the Dunlendings fought with a ferocity born of desperation. They were not just fighting for Saruman, they were fighting for their ancestors, for the hills and plains they had lost. Yet, despite their fervour, they were no match for the unified strength of Rohan. Erkenbrand's charge scattered them like leaves in the wind, and once again, their dream of victory crumbled into ashes. The end of the battle brought no closure to the Dunlendings. Those who survived the carnage at Helm's Deep were shown mercy, but at a cost. The Rohirrim demanded that they renounce Saruman and swear never to take up arms against Rohan again. Though they laid down their weapons, their hatred remained, buried but not extinguished. The bitterness of the Dunlendings was not something that could be erased with treaties or oaths. It was a wound too deep, a scar that had hardened over generations. Even after Saruman's defeat, the Dunlendings would continue to live in the shadow of Rohan's prosperity. Their voices silenced, but their hearts still burning with resentment. This hatred between the Dunlendings and Rohan serves as a poignant reminder of how ancient wounds can shape the fate of entire peoples. It is a story of displacement and survival, of pride and loss, and of how cycles of vengeance can perpetuate suffering. Tolkien, in crafting this enmity, did more than tell a tale of war. He painted a picture of the human condition, where the sins of the past ripple endlessly into the present. The Dunlendings' story is one of tragedy, not only because of their defeats, but because of how their hatred consumed them. In their quest to reclaim their land, they allowed themselves to be manipulated by Saruman, further deepening the divide between them and the Rohirrim. And for the Rohirrim, their pride and disdain for the Dunlendings blinded them to the humanity of their enemies, ensuring that peace would always remain out of reach. Even in the Fourth Age, after the defeat of Sauron and the restoration of peace to Middle-earth, the scars of this hatred lingered. The Dunlendings faded into obscurity, their story one of bitterness and missed opportunities. Yet their struggle, like so much in Tolkien's world, holds lessons for us. It reminds us that the cost of vengeance is often too high, and that true peace requires more than the absence of war. It demands understanding, reconciliation, and a willingness to break the chains of the past. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the fierce rivalry of the Dunlendings and Rohan, we'd be incredibly grateful if you could support our channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Your engagement helps us bring more of Tolkien's legendary world to life. For those who want to take their support further, consider becoming a member. Your membership enables us to uncover even more of Middle-earth's untold stories and share them with you. Until next time, may your journey through Tolkien's world be ever rewarding.